They said he was dead. The emperor lay motionless on his couch at Misenum, the air heavy with the smell of sickness and sweat. But when attendants leaned close, they swore his chest rose again. Whispers turned to panic. If Tiberius still breathed, then Rome was not yet free. At that moment, Lucius Macro, commander of the Praetorian Guard, and Caligula, the eager heir, exchanged a glance. A cloak was thrown across the old man's face. Pillows pressed down. The emperor's frail limbs convulsed muffled gasps, filling the chamber until the silence returned. This time, it was final. News rushed like wildfire through the streets of Rome. At first, the crowd hesitated. Was it true, or just another cruel trick? When confirmation came, the city erupted in cheers. People poured wine into the gutters, danced in marketplaces, and cursed his name, as though they could spit out years of fear in a single day. Never before had the death of a Caesar been met, not with grief, but with relief, even joy. Yet behind that joy lurked a question as chilling as the suffocated breath that ended him. How had a man once celebrated as Rome's finest general, a guardian of empire, descended so far into darkness that his very death was treated like liberation? For 23 years, Tiberius ruled Rome. His armies secured the frontiers. His laws kept order. His name commanded fear. But behind the marble masks of authority and ceremony, behind the laurels of victory, another truth festered. In his exile on the cliffs of Capri, he abandoned restraint. The villas that overlooked the blue waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea became dungeons of indulgence and corruption. Senators vanished into the abyss of treason trials. Children were dragged into nightmares of exploitation, and Rome itself learned to breathe in whispers. And so, when his body was carried away, there were no tears, no mourning processions. The empire stood in the eerie stillness of aftermath, with only one certainty. The man who had once held the fate of millions in his hands had been consumed by the very power he wielded. Tiberius's death was not simply the end of a reign. It was the conclusion of a long descent into paranoia, cruelty, and a debauchery so depraved that history itself struggles to tell it without shuddering. But how did it begin? How did a man born into privilege, trained in the art of war, praised for discipline and intelligence, become the monster Rome despised? The answer lies in the cracks beneath the marble, in the shadows of imperial palaces, and in the darkness of a soul left unchecked by law, tradition, or morality. To understand the horror of his final breath, we must trace back to the very moment he first drew it. Before there was fear, before there was darkness, there was Rome in its golden hour. The empire under Augustus shimmered like a marble dream, its temples rising into the sky, its armies victorious on distant frontiers. For the Roman people, Augustus was not just a ruler, but a living god, the man who had ended civil wars and bound the empire together in order. And in the shadow of this giant stood a tall, quiet figure, Tiberius, the reluctant heir. He was not born to be loved. His face was stern, his manner distant, and his words few. But he possessed what Rome valued most: discipline. As a general, Tiberius was unmatched. His legions marched across Germania and the Balkans, with precision victories, carved into stone arches and whispered in taverns. He could endure hunger, fatigue, and the endless mud of campaign trails. Soldiers followed him, not because he charmed them, but because he never asked of them what he himself could not endure. To Rome, he seemed a man forged from iron, unyielding, reliable, destined to protect the empire's greatness. Within the palaces of Augustus, however, glory came wrapped in chains. The first family of Rome was less a dynasty than a gilded cage where bloodlines were pawns in an eternal game for succession. Tiberius was forced into a marriage he did not want, cast into the bed of Julia Augustus's daughter, brilliant, beautiful, and unfaithful. Their union was not love, but politics, and every night beside her was another wound in his soul. He had loved another woman, Vipsania, gentle and loyal, but Augustus tore them apart. This was the cost of standing near the throne, personal happiness sacrificed to imperial necessity. Yet Rome only saw the marble surface. The banquets glittered with gold fountains spilled with wine, poets recited verses in echoing halls, and the imperial court presented itself as the pinnacle of civilization. To the senators and citizens, the young Tiberius appeared to live in splendor, fine robes, endless feasts, power at his fingertips. But behind his cold eyes grew a silent storm. The life of privilege was also a life of suffocation. Every decision dictated, every alliance forced, every step watched. In these years, the future tyrant was still hidden, trapped beneath layers of duty and control. He was the loyal general, the disciplined son-in-law, the silent shadow of Augustus. The Rome of marble and triumphs had not yet revealed its rot. The empire's heart still beat with order, the streets thrummed with trade, and citizens toasted to the prosperity of Pax Romana. But beneath the surface of that shining order, cracks were forming in Tiberius's soul. It was an empire gilded with glory yet fragile in truth. For the man who seemed unbreakable was already beginning to bend, and once bent Rome would discover iron does not bend, back it shatters. The cracks began as whispers faint enough to ignore but sharp enough to wound. Tiberius, the disciplined general, had served faithfully in Augustus's wars. Yet, in the palace halls, he was never truly trusted. Augustus, always the master of succession, dangled power like a baited hook, never allowing one heir to stand too firmly. Tiberius was both indispensable and disposable, a soldier in the field and a prisoner in the family. His marriage to Julia turned from misery into humiliation. Rome was a city of gossip, and Julia gave it plenty to feast upon. She mocked her husband's severity, entertained lovers openly, and filled the palace corridors with scandal. For a man bred in discipline who valued restraint as a soldier's virtue, her excesses were unbearable. And yet Augustus commanded the union, forcing Tiberius to endure betrayal in silence. What began as a political marriage became a daily crucifixion. Then came the string of deaths. One by one, the heirs Augustus had carefully groomed fell. Marcellus, Gaius, Lucius. Each was marked for succession, each cut down by illness, accident, or fate. In the endless funerals of the imperial family, Augustus's grand design of dynasty collapsed, and with every coffin lowered into the earth, Tiberius was pushed closer to a throne he did not want, yet could not escape. It was as if the gods themselves, cruel and mocking, were stripping away every barrier until only Tiberius remained. The weight of destiny pressed down on him, but rather than pride, it filled him with bitterness. He had been trained to serve, to obey, to endure. He was a soldier, not a politician, and in Augustus's world of masks and schemes, he always felt like an intruder. Even his victories were overshadowed by the praise heaped on others. The Senate lauded Augustus as the architect of triumph, while Tiberius's role as the hammer was quietly set aside. Resentment festered in the silence, and so in an act that stunned Rome, Tiberius withdrew. He begged to retire to escape the coils of Augustus's politics, and in a rare concession, he was allowed to leave. He sailed east to the island of Rhodes, a self-imposed exile. To Rome, it looked like cowardice. To Augustus, it looked like betrayal. To Tiberius, it was the only way to breathe. But exile was not freedom. On Rhodes, he lived like a ghost, watched by spies, ridiculed by senators, estranged from Julia, cut off from his beloved Vipsania. The whispers followed him. He has abandoned Rome. He has fled his duty. The people laughed, the nobility sneered, and even Augustus regarded him with suspicion. What had been meant as escape became another kind of prison, one built not of stone walls, but of disgrace. It was here on Rhodes that the seeds of doom truly took root. Isolation hardened him. Bitterness curdled into paranoia. The man who once marched proudly at the head of legions learned instead to brood in shadows, to listen for insults, to nurture his grievances. Rome had not yet seen the tyrant, but the soil of exile had begun to grow him. In the year 14 AD, the world shifted. Augustus, the man who had bent Rome to his will for nearly half a century, was dead. His ashes would rest in a marble mausoleum, his name etched into eternity. And in that moment of silence after his passing, all eyes turned to the reluctant heir. Tiberius was summoned from the shadows of exile and thrust into the blinding light of absolute power. The Senate, trembling with both fear and hope, hailed him as princeps, the first citizen, the new Augustus. The Praetorian Guard, that lethal army within the city, saluted him as commander. But Tiberius himself hesitated. He stood before the Senate voice low, protesting that he was unworthy, too old, too frail to bear such a burden. Yet everyone in the chamber knew the truth. His reluctance was a mask, and the decision had already been made. Once the purple robe was draped across his shoulders, there was no turning back. The trap had sprung shut. The empire demanded strength, but Tiberius offered caution. He did not dazzle the people with games, nor charm the senators with speeches. Instead, he delegated. He allowed others, especially Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the cunning commander of the Praetorian Guard, to whisper into his ear and tighten the machinery of fear around him. What began as a safeguard soon became a weapon. Whispers of conspiracy spread. Trials for treason, once rare, became frequent. An innocent remark at a banquet could be twisted into a plot against the emperor. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. The shadow of suspicion grew so thick that Rome began to breathe in silence. And through it all, Tiberius watched, outwardly calm, inwardly tightening his grip. The people who had mocked him during his exile now learned the cost of laughter. One by one, rivals disappeared. Accusations fell like daggers. Senators condemned noblewomen, shamed generals, erased from memory. Every death was wrapped in the language of justice. Every execution carried out in the name of protecting the state. But Rome knew the truth. These were not trials. These were purges. And yet, in the early years, there was still hope. The legions along the Rhine mutinied after Augustus's death, demanding better pay, threatening chaos. It was Tiberius's stepson, Germanicus, who calmed them, not the emperor. Germanicus became the darling of Rome, the shining golden general. Everything Tiberius was not. Crowds adored him. Soldiers adored him. Even the Senate adored him. And in the cold heart of Tiberius, admiration twisted into unease. The empire, vast and glittering, now rested entirely on Tiberius's shoulders. The general who once longed for a quiet life of retreat now found himself bound to a throne he could never escape. Duty had chained him, fear surrounded him, and paranoia whispered endlessly in his ear. For Tiberius, the age of restraint was over. The reign of suspicion had begun. Darkness does not fall all at once. It creeps like a slow mist until the world you knew is gone. For Tiberius, that mist began with grief. His beloved son, Drusus, died suddenly, leaving a hollow wound in his heart. Rome whispered of poison, of plots of treachery within the palace walls. Then Germanicus, his charismatic stepson, the golden hope of Rome, was struck down in the east. The empire wept openly, temples filled with offerings to the memory of the young general. Statues were raised in his honor, poets sang of his glory. And Tiberius, still alive, still ruling, was forced to watch as the people mourned another man more deeply than they had ever celebrated him. It was not only loss, but humiliation. Whispers spread that Tiberius himself had arranged Germanicus's death. He denied it, but the rumour clung to him like a shadow. Grief turned to bitterness, and bitterness to suspicion. If his family could not be trusted, who could? In the Senate, he began to see enemies in every corner, men who smiled by day and sharpened daggers by night. Informants flourished eager to feed his paranoia. A careless word could mean death. A dinner guest's joke could be read as treason. Letters arrived daily filled with accusations. A senator plotting rebellion, a noblewoman cursing his name, a general waiting to defect. Each letter was another match thrown into the dry forest of his fear, and each match he answered with fire. The trials began. They were not trials in truth, but performances of fear. Men once proud in purple togas stood trembling, accused of crimes they did not commit. Witnesses lied, prosecutors twisted words, and Tiberius listened in silence, his eyes cold, his face unreadable. Condemnation was inevitable. Death sentences fell with mechanical regularity, and each execution fed his paranoia further. Rome began to suffocate. Senators no longer debated, they grovelled. Friends no longer embraced, they spied. Families spoke in whispers, for even children could be informants. The empire of marble and triumphs became a city of masks where no one dared show their true face. And Tiberius himself, he withdrew. The more he killed, the more he feared, and the more he feared, the more he withdrew. He no longer appeared in public, often choosing instead to remain behind palace walls, hidden, unreachable. He became a ghost emperor, present in decree, absent in flesh. The Rome he ruled was one of silence and shadows, an empire ruled by paranoia. Every ruler must choose what legacy he leaves: love, respect, or fear. Tiberius chose fear, and fear began to consume him as surely as it consumed those around him. The mist had thickened, the darkness had deepened. The man who once marched proudly at the head of legions now sat alone, surrounded not by soldiers, but by phantoms of betrayal whispering endlessly in his ear. Justice in Rome had once been a spectacle of order, a ritual draped in togas and rhetoric, where senators argued in the forum and verdicts carried the weight of law. Under Tiberius, it became theatre bloody merciless and scripted to only one ending. The stage was set by Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was no soldier of glory. He was a master of whispers. He fed Tiberius's paranoia, sharpening suspicion into accusation, accusation into execution. He taught the emperor that enemies were everywhere, and that the only safety was to strike first, to strike ruthlessly. And Tiberius listened. Trials for treason multiplied. A careless remark against the emperor, a laugh at the wrong moment, a dream interpreted as disloyalty, each could bring ruin. Senators, once Rome's proud elite, were reduced to trembling actors in a grotesque performance. They denounced their own colleagues to prove their loyalty. Families turned on each other. Sons accused fathers, wives betrayed husbands. Each denunciation was greeted with nods of solemn duty, but everyone knew the truth. It was not justice, but survival. The condemned were dragged before the Senate. Their charges were absurd, often fabricated, their fate already sealed. Witnesses lied, prosecutors thundered, and those who might have spoken in defense remained silent, afraid their words would condemn themselves. The emperor rarely appeared, but his presence loomed invisible yet suffocating. At the end of each charade, death awaited by execution, by exile, or by forced suicide, Rome's noble families, the very backbone of the Republic, crumbled one by one under the weight of this terror. And Sejanus, the architect of this machinery, grew bolder. With every senator destroyed, his power expanded. He filled the Praetorian ranks with his own loyalists, controlled the flow of accusations, and positioned himself as Rome's hidden master. To the frightened senators it seemed safer to flatter Sejanus than Tiberius. To the people it appeared that Sejanus, not the emperor, ruled. But paranoia, once unleashed, consumes all, including those who wield it. Sejanus's ambition did not escape Tiberius's watchful eye. Whispers began to drift back to Capri, where the emperor now brooded in isolation. Sejanus, it was said, dreamed of marrying into the imperial family, even of wearing the purple himself. For a man who trusted no one, this was betrayal carved into marble. In 31 AD, the trap was turned on the trapper. The Senate, still trembling from years of blood, was ordered to condemn Sejanus. And condemn him they did. The once mighty commander was dragged through the streets, stripped of honours, executed like a criminal, his body torn apart by the mob. Yet Rome did not breathe easier. If even Sejanus could fall, then no one was safe. The machinery of false justice remained in place, its gears grinding endlessly. Trials continued. Deaths multiplied, and the empire sank deeper into silence. Justice had become not a shield, but a sword wielded not to protect Rome, but to feed the emperor's fear. It was no longer a republic of laws, nor an empire of order. It was a court of whispers, where the only true verdict was death. The sun still rose over Rome each morning, gilding the marble temples and filling the streets with bustle, but for Tiberius the empire might as well have been another world. In 26 AD, he withdrew from the capital, vanishing to the rocky cliffs of Capri, an island surrounded by turquoise waters and jagged stone. Officially, it was to recover his health to find peace in old age. In truth, it was an escape, a retreat from the Senate, he despised from the people who mocked him, from a city that never loved him. On Capri, the emperor built villas that seemed to float between sea and sky terraces draped with vines, statues gazing endlessly at the horizon. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the mornings opened with the cries of gulls circling the cliffs. To an outsider, it was paradise. But inside those marble halls, paradise rotted. Capri became not a sanctuary, but a stage where Tiberius played out his darkest desires. Each morning, as the sun broke across the sea, letters arrived from Rome. They carried the names of men and women accused of treason, their supposed crimes written in careful ink. Reclining in luxury, Tiberius would read them slowly, sometimes with a cup of wine in hand, sometimes with a vacant stare at the horizon. With a stroke of his stylus, he condemned them. Nobles, senators, former friends. The blood of Rome spilled quietly, signed away in the stillness of Capri's dawns. And then came the rumors, the stories that history still struggles to tell without shuddering. Children brought to Capri, forced into games no child should know. Noble youths humiliated in grotesque performances for the emperor's pleasure. Old men bribed with wealth to sacrifice their dignity. The villas of Capri became dens of degradation where innocence and honor alike were shattered against the rocks. Whether every tale is true, no one can say, but the consistency of ancient voices. Tacitus Suetonius, Cassius Dio, paints a picture too dark to dismiss. Tiberius once, the disciplined general, now drifted deeper into indulgence, his body frail, but his appetites endless. His mornings began with executions, his afternoons with debauchery, his nights with paranoia. Guards patrolled the cliffs, ready to throw any who displeased him into the sea below. Fishermen claimed they saw bodies bobbing in the waves, broken and left for the tide to carry away. Yet, amid this horror, there were still flickers of humanity, twisted faint, almost pitiable. On some mornings he would sit silently for hours staring at the sunrise, his face creased with age, his eyes heavy with sorrow. Was he remembering Drusus, his lost son Germanicus, the stepson whose memory haunted him, or Vipsania, the only woman he had ever truly loved torn from him by Augustus's will. No one knew, but for a moment in that golden light, he seemed less a monster than a man broken by grief hiding in paradise from the ghosts of Rome. The final sunrise had not yet come, but each day on Capri, as the sky turned red above the sea, Tiberius drifted further from the general he once was and closer to the nightmare history would never forget. Capri was beautiful, yes, but beauty can mask horrors that words can scarcely hold. Behind the sunlit terraces and fragrant gardens, Tiberius forged his island into a theatre of cruelty. What began as whispers grew into legends, tales so grotesque they blur the line between history and nightmare. Yet Rome believed them because Rome had lived in his shadow for too long not to. The screams were said to echo through the marble corridors carried down into the cliffs by the wind. Guards dragged prisoners up steep stone paths, their chains clanging against the rock. Some were senators accused of treason for a careless word. Others were slaves or children, unlucky enough to be chosen for the emperor's amusements. To anger Tiberius, or even to bore him, was to be marched to the cliff's edge where the sea boiled far below. With a flick of his hand, they were hurled into the abyss, their bodies smashing against the jagged rocks before vanishing into the surf. Fishermen spoke of seeing broken limbs tangled in seaweed of gulls pecking at flesh beneath the cliffs. Inside the villas, the cruelty grew more intimate. Ancient sources describe orgies staged like grotesque rituals, with boys and girls trained as playthings, their innocence paraded for the emperor's pleasure. Senators' sons, once destined for power, were humiliated in ways that stripped them of dignity forever. Tiberius, once the embodiment of discipline, now revelled in degradation. His body might have aged, but his appetites deepened into obsession. Every restraint was gone, and Rome trembled. News of the island drifted back to the capital like poisoned smoke. Citizens whispered of the cave of horrors of children forced into unspeakable acts of nobles sent home with souls hollowed out by shame. Whether exaggerated or true, the stories carried a singular weight. They revealed what absolute power does when it no longer fears gods or men. Yet cruelty was not limited to flesh. Tiberius's paranoia sharpened into bloodlust. Each week letters left Capri with names written in the emperor's hand, accusations, condemnations, death warrants. Senators waited like cattle for slaughter, never knowing whose turn would come. Rome became a city of silence, where laughter died in the throat, where loyalty was measured not in deeds, but in denunciations. The sensory contrast was unbearable. The scent of salt and pine mingling with the stench of blood, the golden sunsets gleaming over cliffs that had become execution grounds, the sound of waves carrying the last cries of those cast into the sea. Capri was paradise to the eye, hell to the ear and heart. This was the spectacle of Tiberius's reign, not a single bloody battlefield, but a slow suffocation of Rome's spirit. He ruled not by love nor by admiration, but by terror, an emperor who no longer resembled a man, but a shadow, feeding on fear and flesh. And the most chilling thought of all, that his cruelty did not erupt suddenly, but grew naturally from grief, suspicion, and power left unchecked. Capri was not an accident. It was the logical end of a life twisted by fate and sharpened by solitude. Here at last, Rome saw what happens when discipline shatters, when power becomes appetite, when a man once forged of iron corrodes into rust. It was not just the death of innocence, but the death of trust, the death of Rome's moral heart. The end came quietly, without spectacle, without glory. By 37 AD, Tiberius was a frail shadow of the soldier he had once been. His skin sagged, his eyes dulled his voice, a rasp more suited to whispers than commands. Yet even in weakness, he inspired terror. Senators prayed for his death, Generals waited in tense silence, and the people of Rome counted the days as though they were trapped under a storm that refused to break. At Misenum, along the Bay of Naples, the emperor's last retreat became his deathbed. The sea lapped gently against the shore, a sound almost too peaceful for the man who had drowned Rome in fear. Attendants hovered at his side, watching each shallow breath, wondering if this one might be the last. And then suddenly, word spread through the chamber, Tiberius is dead. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. No weeping, no wails of grief, only uncertainty. His heir Caligula and the Praetorian commander Macro exchanged glances. But then a voice cried out, "He's still breathing!" Horror froze the room. The old man's chest stirred faintly, a rattling gasp clawing back life for one more moment. If he lived, the celebrations already brewing in Rome would turn into a massacre. If he lived, Caligula's future might vanish before it began. What happened next was whispered for generations. A cloak thrown across the emperor's face, a pillow pressed down, firm, merciless. No sword, no dagger, only suffocation, the death of a criminal rather than a Caesar. His limbs convulsed weakly, then stilled, and in that stifled gasp, the reign of Tiberius ended. The silence in the room deepened. Caligula, young and trembling, stood not in grief but in shock, realizing that the empire was his. Macro, expression cold, gave the order to ensure no revival was possible. Only then did relief ripple through the chamber like prisoners released from chains. Far away in Rome, the silence did not last. When the news reached the city, it shattered into celebration. Crowds poured into the streets, pouring wine into the gutters, raising toasts to freedom. Some cursed his name aloud, others burned his effigies. Many simply wept with joy. No emperor before had been sent to the grave with such open hatred. It was as though an evil spirit had finally been exorcised from the empire. But even in that noisy release, there was an eerie undertone. For the silence of his deathbed lingered. The manner of his passing, suffocated in whispers and pillows, seemed less like the fall of a mighty emperor, and more like the extinguishing of something rotten, hidden, shameful. Rome rejoiced. Yet beneath the cheers lay a shiver. If the empire could produce a ruler like Tiberius, once could it not do so again? The silence after his last breath was not peace. It was warning. History remembers Tiberius not in marble, but in shadows. He began as Rome's shield, a general who marched where others faltered, a man of discipline who endured mud, hunger, and cold alongside his soldiers. In another life, he might have been remembered as the empire's greatest protector. But power has a way of twisting even the strongest metal, and in the furnace of the imperial throne, Tiberius was not tempered, he was warped. His reign lasted 23 years. In that span, Rome remained secure, its borders held firm, its coffers filled with wealth. On paper, it was stability. In reality, it was suffocation. Fear replaced loyalty. Whispers replaced debate. Justice became performance. And Capri, his chosen sanctuary, became a byword for corruption so vile that even centuries later, historians write of it with unease. The irony is cruel. Tiberius preserved the empire yet poisoned its soul. He left Rome intact, but mistrust embedded in its veins. When he died, the people cheered. Yet the empire he left behind was not free of him. The culture of suspicion, the machinery of terror, the silence of fear, all of it endured. His successor, Caligula, would inherit not a clean slate, but a corrupted stage, one already darkened by the shadows of paranoia and indulgence. What does his legacy teach us? That greatness without love curdles into fear. That discipline without humanity hardens into cruelty. That absolute power, once unchecked, does not simply corrupt it, devours. Tiberius was not born a monster. He was shaped into one piece by manipulation, by exile, by grief, by isolation, and finally by the intoxicating certainty that no one could stop him. Rome cursed his name, but Rome also built the throne that made him. And that truth is what makes his story endure. For Tiberius is not just a figure of the past, he is a warning. A reminder that the line between a ruler and a tyrant is thin, and that even a man forged in discipline can crumble when power frees him from restraint. So when we imagine that suffocating final breath, when we picture the joy of Rome at his death, the question remains, was the monster in Tiberius alone, or in the empire that created him? And if history gave us such a warning once, do we dare believe it could never happen again? The silence after his death still whispers. It whispers in every chamber of power, where ambition festers, in every nation, where fear silences truth, in every leader who confuses control with greatness. Tiberius is gone, but his shadow lingers, and if we fail to remember it, so too may his fate return.